Please join me in welcoming our very distinguished panel, Mr. George Elliott Clarke. I'll sit here.
Everybody.
Huda Hassan and Shad Kabango.
All right.
And thank all of you for coming once again. Let me just introduce the three of you. This might take a few moments. George Elliott Clarke is the 4th Poet Laureate of Toronto, 2012 to 15, the 7th Parliamentary Poet Laureate, 2016 to 17, and he is what I think we could say is Canada's greatest living poet.
All right.
And public intellectual as well. You can take that?
I'll accept that.
All right, good. He is a noted artist in song, drama, fiction, screenplay, essays, and poetry. Now teaching African Canadian literature at the University of Toronto. Clarke has taught at Duke, McGill, and the University of British Columbia and Harvard. He holds 8 honorary doctorates, plus appointments to the Order of Nova Scotia and the Order of Canada. His recognitions include the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Fellows Prize, the Governor General's Award for Poetry, the National Magazine Gold Award for Poetry, and many, many other prizes. His 16th poetry work is Canticles 1, 2016, which is the first half of the first book of a 3-book epic treating imperialism, slavery, and resistance to both. Welcome, George Elliott Clarke. Huda Hassan is a journalist, cultural commentator, and a PhD student in women and gender studies at the University of Toronto. She holds an MA in Humanities from York University and an HBA in African Studies, Philosophy, and Political Science from the University of Toronto. Her research areas include critical race theory, Black studies, cultural studies, media theory, and post-colonialism. Her work has appeared in the National Post, Now Magazine, The Fader, BuzzFeed, and Gawker, and she's also appeared on CBC's Metro Morning and The Current, and CTV News, and if you know Huda on Twitter, she is fire.
Woo! Huda! Right.
Shad, also known as Shadrach Kabango, was a Juno Award-winning rapper and songwriter born in Kenya and raised in London, Ontario. He's toured Canada, the US, and Europe extensively and received praise from the likes of Pitchfork, the National Post, and the Village Voice. He participated in CBC's Canada Reads debates in 2012 and won it, successfully defending Carmen Aguirre's memoir, Something Fierce. Shad hosted CBC's flagship arts and culture show Q, 2015 to 2016, and also hosted HBO Canada's Hip Hop Evolution, a 4-part documentary on the history of hip hop. He's working on something new. He's not telling us much about it. Shad.
Woo!
I'm so glad to see all of you here. This film sometimes takes a moment to digest, to let it work on you. So we can do that. But I want to maybe start, George, if you might, by telling us a little bit about how you put Baldwin's words to work now. He died 30 years ago almost, but his words feel more relevant than ever. How do you put his words to work now?
Well, I would say that, first of all, the work is deathless. The author has been gone for almost 30 years. It was 30 years ago, 1987, in November, he passed away, as I recall. But the work is relentlessly relevant because of the fact that the underlying socio-political, economic, cultural, psychological issues that he dealt with are still very much with us. I think it's important to recognize that Baldwin was writing at a time of decolonization. I mean, he goes to Paris 1948, and that's in essence the birth of Israel, the birth of independent India and Pakistan. It's the beginnings of a decline, finally, in American, European imperialism, notions of white world, white global supremacy. And Baldwin was challenging all of that in terms of its American expression. And I have to say that despite the stalwart struggle of many, black, white, brown, red, yellow, against white supremacy and notions of white supremacy, empowered white supremacy. And I like the statement in the film that we can connect that to power and connect it to the Chase Manhattan Bank and also, of course, to capitalism in general, globalist capitalism especially. These issues remain very, very much with us. And we can connect many crimes in the world today to the continued association of some of the ideas of their economic superiority with notions of their supposed civilizational superiority or just racial superiority. So as Baldwin attacked this fundamental problem in the world 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, his diagnosis, along with those put forward by people like Frantz Fanon, for instance, and I think you got to think about Baldwin and Fanon together, sincerely, remain absolutely au courant today, and that's despite the Barack Obama presidency and the great strides that so many of us have made in the last couple of generations.
I'm glad to see you linking Baldwin to so many international geopolitical strains, but also other writers like Fanon. Huda, I want to ask you a little bit about borders and crossing borders, particularly as a public intellectual as Baldwin was. You're doing, I think, similar kind of public intellectual work now in terms of trying to get ideas outside of the academy, at least from what I've seen. And the world that we're living in here in Toronto, in Canada, is not the same as Baldwin's world. Obviously, 30, 40 years removed, a different nation, a different set of imperial political currents. But how does his work cross borders and connect with the kind of work that you're doing now?
There's a moment in the film, I haven't watched it enough times to have everything memorized, where he was talking about this distinction, or what might be a distinction between the North and the South, the Black experience in the North and the Black experience in the South, where he says, I can't remember what the word was, but where he was articulating a Black suffering that might be conducted a different way, but is essentially the same. It's Black suffering. I think that's how we need to start conceptualizing our understanding of Black experiences. It's not exclusive to nation states. What we see in the US, we often see this comparison or this conversation about what's going on south of the border. It's not different from what's going on here at all.
Shad, I want to ask you a little bit about your connection to his writing as a writer yourself, as a hip hop artist yourself. And again, I'm fascinated by the public aspect of this. This wasn't somebody who just sort of sat in a room and wrote. He went on TV shows. He put his body on the line in many ways in terms of talking about his sexuality at a time when that was very dangerous, in terms of leaving the US and making a public statement about that. Where do you see what Baldwin showed us? Where do you see that in hip hop now? Is there any kind of parallel?
Yeah, well, I can say, firstly, what I admire about him as an artist myself is probably two things. One, his clarity. There's a lot of talk in this film about reality and him continually sort of affirming our sense of reality as Black people, and also just really his clarity, his insight. And the second thing as an artist I admire so much is his vulnerability. Incredible vulnerability. There's a lot of talk in this film about his shame, his experiences of humiliation, his experiences of fear. As a Black man, as an artist himself, that's powerful. That's a powerful example. Black artists that do that today, I mean, there's still few. It's still hard for us to have that level of clarity and to have that kind of courage as Black artists, as Black men, maybe in particular, to be that vulnerable about our experiences.
Among your peers in hip hop, is there anybody that you see who's kind of continuing Baldwin's tradition?
Oh, see, I hesitated to answer your question directly because I'm going to drop the K word, Shad. The Kanye word, which is a controversial one. But at my age, and I've seen his career, and his career has had a tremendous impact on me, and I've seen moments of incredible vulnerability, of clarity, of courage, and artistic excellence. So he would be the first to come to mind.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned vulnerability. I want to talk a little bit about that. Baldwin really was a unique figure. And one of the things that some people have said is not in this film enough is maybe more of that vulnerability, more of his kind of his intimate life, including his sexuality, but not limited to that. As you were watching the film, did you feel that that was an omission? Any of you?
Yeah, that was the first thing that I thought when I was watching it. You can't talk about dehumanization, criminality of a black individual without, especially like a black queer individual, and not talk about their sexuality. I think it was a very limited understanding or construction and perception of his life. And I think that's very damaging in many ways, because we think of blackness as this homogenous thing that is very cis heteropatriarchal, and who we highlight and who we deem as prophets sometimes don't include folks who are out, who pretty much exist outside of this very limited understanding of blackness. And I think that's what was kind of indirectly being done in the film.
Interesting. George, Shad, what do you make of that?
Well, I think that the limit in the film, so to speak, was simply the fact that Raoul Peck was trying to stick with the script. The unfinished novel, or the novel that had just been begun, the first 30 pages of notes, with, of course, Samuel L. Jackson's voicing those notes, and then, of course, finding the images, or selecting the images to support the reading of that unfinished script, and at the same time trying to suggest how it was relevant to today. As opposed to its origins in 1979. But then the origins are not really 1979. It's really that constellation of male civil rights activists, leaders, African American, Malcolm, Martin, Medgar, and actually the sexuality, so to speak, the sexual aspect of the film came from Baldwin's different levels of interaction and appreciation and admiration for all three of these leaders, political figures. And in fact, I would say that that was a strong homoerotic element in his appreciation of those three men. Yes, it's not stressed in the film, although I do think you can read some of the images, most definitely, as in terms of a homoerotic presentation of those three men. And of course, Baldwin's own self. He's not necessarily, or there's no need to out him, so to speak, in the film, because I think we all know enough of his biography to know that he was a gay man. At the same time, that's true. His relationship to those three iconic figures, and especially Malcolm X, who was so homophobic in his utterances and his public presentation of himself. The fact that Baldwin was able to find ways to connect with Malcolm and to find what was valuable in his critique, and to salvage him in some ways as a figure worthy of emulation and certainly worthy of understanding, I think spoke to his underlying masculinist, perhaps, interest in X as I might venture to say, from Malcolm's point of view, as a kind of expression of a dangerous, at least in terms of white America, a dangerous black masculinity.
Do you think that that there's a kind of a representation of Baldwin through not just the images that we see of him speaking, but also the voiceover that's done by Samuel L. Jackson, which kind of complicates his representation? Because this is not a typical Sam Jackson performance, right? His voice sounds different. Some people have called it his best performance in many years, because it's not, there's none of that what we have come to see from Sam Jackson, come to expect from him, but it feels more intimate. There's an interiority to it, which partly comes from the voiceover, partly from the text. But does that complicate the representation for you, Shad, of Baldwin here?
When I listen to the narrations, yeah, definitely. Samuel L. Jackson disappeared from my mind. I'd never heard him like that. it didn't make me think so much about the representation of Baldwin as much as I was listening to the silence in the room when those words were being spoken. So I guess less the narrations and more the text. Okay. And not just how powerful the words are, but how it seems that we're so thirsty for that level of clarity around what we're living and what the realities of our world.
I want to ask all of you about that thirst, because one of the things we're seeing right now is cultural products, pop cultural products, movies, records, TV shows, being really taken up as political flags in a way. So, whether it's this film, Moonlight, a lot of the TV shows that are happening right now, How to Get Away with Murder, or Kendrick Lamar's last album, or these things that take on more than just aesthetic value, but there's a real political value in the way people consume them and embrace them and use them to go out in the world and fight battles that we need to fight. Why do you think that's happening now? Why is a film like this being taken up not just as a documentary, but as something that can actually help people fight battles?
I'm not going to say that this is necessarily an example of this, or the examples that you gave, but I would call those weapons of mass distraction. In the context of making folks, particular communities, actually all of us, think that something is happening when in actuality it might not be. And that's what I mean by weapons of mass distraction. Really?
So the examples I cite, there might be others as well. There's so much going on right now where people are saying, this album, this movie, this TV show, it's giving me life. It's kind of helping me go out in the world and deal with what I have to deal with. You're not buying that.
It's not the first time we've seen moments like this. It's not the first. It's repetitive, right? How often has the artist... And it's not the first time that we've seen political messages being served to the masses in certain ways. And I think that it's a weapon of mass distraction. And I think that they come and they go and they come and they go.
And nothing changes?
Every time that they come, we think that something's changing. But in actuality, nothing is.
George, Shad?
Sorry, I'm a pessimist.
But you're alive, so you have to be an optimist.
Yes, I'm
right?
also a Black Muslim woman.
I'm not a pessimist. I'm not an optimist either. I'm a realist. And what I see is that folks gravitate generally in eras of struggle, in eras of discomfort, which is basically all the time. Folks do tend to gravitate towards, and sometimes the market writ large tries to nudge and push us in certain directions in terms of consuming materials related to protests of one sort or another. I do think that there's an element of truth in that. At the same time, there is also an element of real struggle, and real struggle that requires a cultural arm to assist it along. I'm thinking of the example of the beat movement, for instance, in the 1950s, moving into the 1960s, and the fact that Allen Ginsberg's Howl comes to mind as an important statement in poetry against the demand for conformity, to hypocrisy, to Cold War, to homophobic attitudes, to racism, to sexism. And that poem itself, and the very title, is a howl against all that. You can buy it. It's a cultural commodity, but at the same time, it is, or was, for its time period, 1955, 1956, an actual expression of real angst and real anger against the way things were. And it did help to stimulate other people to write, to sing, to record, to dance, to make movies, to make documentaries that were in opposition to the way things were. So even though the superstructure is still here, we live in a globalist, capitalist reality, it doesn't change the fact that there can be authentic, artistic products, so to speak, that are vehicles of authentic expressions of dissent from the way things are.
So Huda's nodding her head. So do you agree with what George is saying?
Yeah, I'm not saying what I said is not about all artistry. It's the artistry that is served on a certain level and accessible to the masses.
Okay. Shad, distraction or useful weapon?
Well, when I was watching the film, I was actually struck by how it seems to me that music and art maybe actually has less of a place in culture, or back to what I was saying about the thirst for James Baldwin's words for documentary film. I feel like people want history more than they want art. People want that level of clarity and precision and straight talk, actually, more than they want music. I think music has less value in society than it did.
Really?
That's my view.
All right. Don't put yourself out of work. We're going to open it up to you because I'm sure with all of you here, some of you have got things to say. I believe we've got microphones on both sides of the room. So if you've got a question, and we really like questions, comments, we like questions. So if you got a question, put your hand up. We'll get a microphone to you. Yes, go ahead.
I got lots of questions, but I'll just give you guys one. All right, so I see the dynamic differences here between all three of these individuals. But Huda, I'm going to ask, sorry, that's how you pronounce your name, right?
Yeah, you got it.
I'm going to put my sister on the spot because I really admire you and some of the things you're saying. So in this film, they discussed how we see white people say certain things and then revolt and then it's celebrated. But when black people do it, it's criminalized. And then it essentially aids us in being docile. Because then a lot of us are like, hey, I don't want to do this because I don't want to look like I'm a thug or I'm a gangster, I'm being bad. And a lot of times we end up tone policing our brothers and sisters. So my question to you with respect to that narrative, do you believe that we should, and again, don't let any faces in here stop you from really telling me the truth, because I have my own very strong opinions. But do you believe that we should be revolting and becoming violent if necessary to stop racism from happening?
Damn. I like the cue cards better. No, that was an amazing question. So I just want to clarify, you're asking is, there's a spectrum of how to react to oppression. Is revolt the way that we should all be navigating towards?
Yes, and the reason why is because, oh, sorry. And let me just kind of add a little more context. Because we did see, let's say, the differences between Malcolm and Martin. Mm-hmm. And we did see that after Malcolm died, Martin then started to kind of come out and start to talk about how he felt like integration may not have necessarily been the best thing. We also heard James talk about the whole aspect of by any means necessary to get this done. So considering that we're now 400 years down, things are changing, but they're not changing in a way where racism is not going away, right? So do you believe that this whole niceness that we have where we're kind of, and I'm saying this as nicely as possible, pandering to almost like our survival every day is dependent on how nice we are to white people? So do you believe that we should start doing what's necessary, even if that includes violence, to stop racism from happening?
Someone said no. I want to point out all these individuals did have different approaches and different ideologies in terms of their response and reactions to anti-blackness. And I also want to point out, which the film did, they all ended up dead. They all ended up dead in different ways, whether it was direct state violence, what we're seeing right now with Black Lives Matter at the hands of a police officer with a gun, the FBI. Let's talk about surveillance and the FBI and what the FBI did to a lot of civil rights activists and what they still do to folks. But sometimes what we tend to exclude when we talk about Black death is slow death. So we saw that with Lorraine Hansberry. We saw that with Malcolm. We saw that with Audre Lorde. We saw that with all these folks who were doing all this work who might not have been directly killed, but they were killed through that process of doing the work. We kill ourselves slowly, right? So I think that there is no right answer to that. It's you determine how you want to die.
All right. Yes, this over here.
Yeah, so Baldwin and Kennedy's exchange there at that midpoint of the movie sort of prophetically said that there might be a black president in 40 years. I wanted to hear your comments of the panel placing maybe Baldwin's interpretation of the Obama presidency into his line of thinking, and perhaps how it really did not deliver for the black community. Something like Black Lives Matter or the movement for Black Lives rose up during a time where we did have a black president. And Dr. Cornel West, I think he's a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, has gone so far as to call Barack Obama the black face of Wall Street. So I wondered if you guys could comment on that in light of Baldwin's thinking on this issue.
No light questions. That's all right. That's all right. Go ahead, George.
I would not disagree with Cornel West's assessment of the Obama presidency. I think that the presidency was extremely important in terms of symbolism, but it was a great disappointment, I think, for anyone who was interested in the kind of change that he suggested he could bring, and which attracted so much support from mainstream America, in quotation marks, as well as, of course, minority America, African America in particular. And given the fact that the United States was in a basket case condition, given the war it had launched in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, which was, in my opinion, a war crime, as well as the massive fraud perpetrated by Wall Street that basically almost destroyed the entire global economy, and the fact that people were really suffering, really hurting in America. And I think the great strength of the Obama campaign in 2007, 2008 is the fact that his campaign actually told Americans the truth about Iraq and about the economy. And that's what I think propelled his candidacy all the way from the streets to the White House, ultimately. But once he got there...
Let me just interrupt briefly, George, if you don't mind. What can we imagine about what Baldwin might have made of the Obama presidency?
I think if he was being really generous, he would have felt that Obama did the best he could under the circumstances, or that he was also a little bit naive about the ability of a black president to really speak to race relations and bring everyone together. But that was never going to be possible, given the fact that I think really to come to the point, Obama had a choice in 2008, 2009, and that was to be that candidate of change, a radical change for a society that was actually ready for it, or to essentially allow things to go on as they always had, but with a little more intelligence, a little more style, and much better rhetoric.
Okay. Any other thoughts quickly, Shad or Huda?
Yeah, not much to add to that. I don't think I can assess his presidency, but there is something again in Baldwin's clarity and what he talked about when he talks about reality, which is that it's difficult for black people to maintain that that correct view of reality. Even he talks about the subjugated, mind, and so I do kind of agree with George that there might be some generosity there if he were to assess the Obama presidency in light of that, and in light of the fact that he's a president of America, and America is America.
Right. Okay, let's go here.
Good evening. Good evening. Hi, black people. That was very tough. I'm thinking about who the film was made for. Particularly because I'm a black gay man who came of age in libraries in Rexdale, as a queer kid, reading and rereading the work of Baldwin. And I was a bit taken aback today, because black folks know that our lives are sort of connected to death and to violence. And so I was taken aback by all of the violence in the film. The beating of Rodney King, the open casket of Malcolm, the the sort of like sexual assault of those Native women. There was so much violence in the film. And I'm wondering about, what do you think about that kind of consumption? Was that made for black people to consume, or was it made for white folks to consume? And thinking about beyond who the film was made for, what do you think about the juxtapositions, right? The sort of like really vivid acts of violence, and then the really like sort of like merry-go white folks jumping up and down and dancing. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that, right? That juxtaposition and who the film was made for, because as a black person, I'm tired of seeing black people dying on the screen. I'm just done, right? And so I'm wondering about consumption and the audience and.
Huda, do you want to take that? Thank you.
I want to say thank you, Lolly. That was actually a very important point. I was doing a talk last week where I was talking about lynchings, and I asked, it was to some high school students, and I asked them as a trick question, when did they think lynchings as a white tradition, as a white logic, when did that end? And the answer that I was hoping for, that I was waiting for, is that it never did. We've been seeing, it's never stopped, but this fascination around Black death and like public viewings of Black death, every time we hear of another young Black person slain or killed, we see the image of their dead body over and over and over again in the news. And it's that very same question, who is this for? Who's supposed to be seeing this, and what are we trying to evoke? So I did think that too when I was watching the film. I personally would have loved a pre-warning before I saw someone lynched and substances coming out of their mouth, seeing Black death, because the way that what I see and what I feel when I see Black death versus another white audience member and what they see and what they feel, it's two very different feelings. And that's a feeling that I go home with that they don't have to. So that's why it's an important question.
Okay. There was a question here.
Hi there. So I wanted to go back to your point of the media being kind of like a weapon of mass distraction. And I want to keep the media accountable. So I was wondering how you think we can keep the media accountable, just like, for example, Vice or TIFF. And instead of creating just these like media products to consume, what more can we do from the inside?
Do I have to answer that?
I give it a shot.
I'm not sure. I don't know. My thought was that music, at least music in particular, because I have experience with music, has less of a place. That doesn't have the same place that it had in society. You know, they flash photos, images there of Bob Dylan, for example. You know, different artists of that era, and I just think they occupied a different space than our artists happen to occupy now, and that's a function of, I guess, our culture, also technology. I think that we're thirsty and we're desperate for voices that we can trust.
You don't think
There's
Beyonce occupies a kind of a revolutionary space?
No, I don't. I love Beyonce. I don't think that she occupies the same place in culture. I think that's partly a function of technology. The fact that there are way more voices, and voices are there are way more voices. So I think there's a lot of noise. I think we're desperate for voices that we can trust. What can we do? Elevate the voices we do trust when we find them.
All right. I want to. Someone here? Yes, go ahead.
Thanks so much for your comments so far, guys. I guess I'm curious about, Shad, you mentioned there's a yearn for history. There's a thirst for, historical interpretations. You mentioned the silence that kind of came over the theater as these words kind of came out. And so I think, I've been thinking a lot about the protests in the post-Trump era, of people who are so good at organizing, getting to a place, and then saying, now what do we do? Now how do we push on the levers of power? And so I'm curious about your thoughts about who are the keepers of that history, of how to properly protest, how to properly stop the advances of whatever power structures, and who are the keepers of those histories now?
I guess I'll start by saying I think that there is a thirst for a global perspective, something Huda's been speaking to and George has been speaking to, and because I think we feel it almost on a cellular level that our struggles are connected all over the world. But we don't necessarily have the firm knowledge and perspective. And I think we thirst for that. I think that we believe, and I think that it's true that there is a key in that, in having that full global perspective and outlook. There's a key to power somewhere in there. I don't know exactly what it is. I think that it's somewhere in there. I think it's somewhere in a global perspective and a historical perspective.
I like that we're asking unanswerable questions, and I like that we're admitting when we don't know the answer. Also important. I want to go up in the balcony. Is there anybody up in the balcony who's got a question or something to say? We often don't get up to you. Over here? Go ahead. You're gonna have to call out because I don't know if we've got a microphone. Okay, please go ahead. Questions about different forms of protest instead of street protests, economic boycotts.
Do you mean the use of the dollar in the sense of like being very selective with where you put your money? For instance, like a black-owned business versus like me buying clothing from a black-owned woman versus like the Gap.
Vote with their money, yeah. I think that's the question. Is that a better form of protest than street protests?
I think there's a privilege that needs to be dissected there. Because for you to have the option of where you want to place your money, like even the Uber, my girl Kim actually pointed this out to me in a way. When the Uber protest or boycott happened, in solidarity with Muslim folks, it comes down to like, can you afford? Uber is apparently a very affordable way of getting around. Can I afford to live a life without Uber? Just that sounded really weird, but I think boycotting is a very. I think you have to be in a privileged position to determine where your money goes and where it goes.
Yeah, there's a way that goods become cheap in the marketplace, and often that can be the subject of boycotts. But then, what can you do if you can't afford cheap goods? I mean, if you can afford only cheap goods.
I think that history, again, is a guide here. There was the Montgomery bus boycott, and yes, it meant that African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, had to walk, they had to carpool, they had to find whatever way they could, bicycles, whatever, to get to work or get to wherever they had to go, but they stayed off those buses for a year until the bus company relented, and that was the beginning of the civil rights movement. So, you know, I wanted to springboard further from here to say that in terms of protests, use every means necessary. Quote Malcolm X, by any means necessary. If boycott's going to work, if boycott's the way to go, then do that. If it's sanctions, and after all, sanctions basically a kind of boycott. I mean, we had sanctions against apartheid South Africa, at least some nations did. Others tried to fight against that and try to prevent sanctions from having any kind of real impact on the apartheid regime, but they did. And in the end, apartheid fell apart. Which doesn't mean that it led to liberation of everybody, but it was an important step in the process towards democratizing South Africa, or trying to democratize South Africa. So I think ultimately, we are all called to analyze our particular situation. And depending on what that is, to evolve, utilize the tools that we believe collectively are going to help bring about a change. Right now, some folks who might have thought about visiting the United States might choose not to. And if enough people choose not to go, it's making a very profound statement about how some of us might choose to see the current administration that Americans have found themselves afflicted with. Without having to do any kind of street protest, but the silent protest of the where we choose to go if we have the ability to make a choice in terms of vacationing or what have you, or business contacts, making a statement in that way. So the only other thing I got to say about all this is that, and this is in reference to the question about media. I think the way to hold media accountable is for ourselves to be aware of history. Real history, our history, collective history, ethnic history, economic history. Because we're constantly being bamboozled, or people are constantly trying to bamboozle us and fool us by relying on the fact that we may not know our history. And so that's the best way to hold media to account. The best way to avoid alternative facts is to have history. You can't talk about post-racial. You can't talk about post-colonial. You can't talk about postmodern unless you have a knowledge of history. And then you can say, we're not post anything.
All right. George.
Sincere.
We're going to go right here, then over here. Go ahead.
In a purely Canadian context, where do you think that the prioritization of anti-Black racism and issues that specifically and uniquely impact Black Canadians are on the Canadian and Ontario agenda? And what do you think that the folks in this room and all of our varying backgrounds, I'm a lobbyist, and I know there are many people in this room that are in their different careers and spaces able to be working together. What are the specific next steps that you think we need to be making to move it up based on where you think it currently is?
I guess I'll start. To your point, George, about knowledge, I think a lot of the knowledge that we have right now in our community we hold within ourselves and within our communities. I am curious how much kind of race-based statistics and numbers we have also to lean on and to use as a tool politically. I guess that's a question that I have, that if we don't have as much as we need, maybe that's a next step.
Anyone else?
Continue to demand absolute accountability from elected officials. They're there to represent us, everybody. And so it's very important for Black citizens to continue to demand accountability in terms of education, educational policy, in terms of economic policy, in terms of transportation policy, housing policy, everything. We should understand which level of government is crucial in terms of respecting a particular issue, and then go after our representatives, demand that they represent us, demand that they seek remedial legislation, improved legislation, good legislation, proper legislation, and we should be very prepared to punish those who fail to show up, who fail to represent, and I'm using the term in the slang sense, who fail to represent by spurning them at the ballot box, or by putting ourselves forward as candidates, or mobilizing to support a particular candidate. These are all, we supposedly live in a democracy, and I believe that we do. So we should take advantage of that fact and mobilize ourselves to put into power as much as possible candidates that we have every right to believe will actually deliver on the promises that they make, and seek popular representatives. Representatives who will actually stand for the platforms and programs that we collectively as a community feel that we need. And not to accept anything less than that. And that goes for everybody, premier, prime minister, mayor, councilors. Go for it.
Thank you, George. Right here, whoever's got the microphone, yes.
I have a question about what kind of, like, it's kind of, I'm asking it on standing in the shoes of an immigrant in this country, but also a Black woman who feels like I feel an overwhelming sense of hopelessness when I look at the way that activists are treated and the way that the images that are put forward by the people who hold power in this country, and I'm talking about this country as well. I feel an overwhelming sense of hopelessness because I don't know what my activism looks like as a person who can't necessarily reach out to a representative, as a person who is being showed these negative images and these images of Black death and being shown what happens to people when they speak out and when they try to literally exist in this country within their identity. So I'm a university student, but I'm also an artist, and I hope that I'm an activist, and I hope that I can find a voice, but I'm having a really hard time finding that voice. And I'm not necessarily pessimistic. I mean, I grew up in a family of activists. My mother was born in 1960 in South Africa. She knows what struggle looks like. My dad was an activist on his campus at Carleton University. But that should be a testament to the fact that there are people who didn't grow up with the background that I grew up with and who are even more hopeless and who don't know what their voices look like. So I was wondering, what are some of the ways that we can kind of exist in this world and not feel like we're like trash, essentially?
No, I think she's asking something very
She's
important.
speaking for herself,
Yeah.
yes.
And we
All right.
no, we don't need to do
So
that.
she's speaking from where she is located. Huda, did you want to respond?
Thank you for asking that. I'm gonna say thank you for that. I appreciated that. I think that was an important question, sincerely. I just want to say one thing, and I feel like maybe you guys might answer this better than myself. I think that when we think of activism, what activism is, when we try to articulate activism, it's resistance, it's fighting systems, it's combating this, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but this shit that's killing folks, right? I think that staying alive is resistance in itself. I think that is activism in itself. You existing in this world as the individual that you are, and staying alive and trying your best to take care of yourself, and if you're lucky, to take care of the folks around you. That is activism and resistance in itself. So that's the thing that came to my mind when you were asking that question.
The first thing that came to mind is, as an artist, I think that being creative is innately human. It's something that everybody has, the ability to be creative. For some reason in this culture, we just kind of like take 1 out of 1,000 and we say they're artists and nobody else is, but I don't think that that's true. I think art is a space where you can be you. And it's so, I can say from personal experience that that's so important, so valuable in a world where it's difficult for us to be who we are, to at least have a space where you can speak your truth and you can be vibrant, you can be joyful, you can be honest. Just don't believe the lie that exists in the society that that's just for a select few people. It's not.
Right. You both already said it, but just in a phrase, art is activism. Activism is art. To be an artist is to be an activist. To be an artist is to be an intellectual. To be an artist is to be somebody who wants to see things different, who does see things different and wants things to be different, and whose art, therefore, is going to be transformative because of that interest in having things become different, better for everybody. We know the histories of resistance movements, revolutionary movements all over the world. And art is always a signal part of it. It's always the harbinger. It's why they call it the avant-garde. It's the harbinger of what's to come. It's the harbinger of change. It's the barometer of change, the thermometer of change. And artists are often persecuted for that very reason. And we can look at the history of various art movements and see that. We can all remember, or some of us can remember, I can remember when hip-hop was frowned upon, when hip-hop was denounced, when hip-hop was dissed, when rap music was dissed. And yet rap music has been the most transformative popular art form for the last 40 years, for crying out loud. But it began with a whole lot of hostility, police hostility, for crying out loud. So the most important activism, in my opinion, that some of us can do is to be artists and insist on that and share our art as widely as we can.
Thank you, all of you. I will just add one brief note. We've just watched a film about a man whose only product in the world were his words. That's all he did. James Baldwin didn't go out on the street. He didn't protest. He didn't go to Washington, D.C. or any of those places and lobby. He wrote and he spoke. And he spoke truth. And you see it even in Dick Cavett. He was, in the Dick Cavett show, he was not afraid to make Dick Cavett uncomfortable. He could do it with a look, you know what I mean? And even just interrupting the flow of what you might, be receiving as oppression, interrupting that, stopping it, confronting it in very small, intimate ways. I think that can make a huge difference. Sometimes it's a matter of words, but that's I think what all of us need to do in our daily lives as much as we can. And it does work. It does make a difference. All right, we got, I think, a few more questions we can take.
Sorry, can I just point out that this person had their hand up for a while?
Okay. All right, we will come to you in one moment. We got microphone right here, then over to, microphone's already.
Yeah, right here.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. We'll be coming to you as, I think everybody's got a question.
Yeah.
You go ahead.
All right. Well, my question is, Baldwin passed away 30 years ago. 30 years ago, I'm a former athlete, and this past NFL season, Colin Kaepernick decides to protest by kneeling down for the national anthem. If Baldwin was alive today, how receptive would you have been to that demonstration, and also the division that I've witnessed amongst black athletes against who were for Colin Kaepernick and against him? How would Baldwin be perceptive of that?
I will take a guess and say very receptive. Yeah, Colin he's demonstrated so well. He's spoken so well to the issues that are close to his heart, and he's kind of taken up the mantle of people like Muhammad Ali and John Carlos so well. I can't imagine him not being proud of that.
Thank you. We'll go right here.
Hi. So before I had a question, but I did want to reply to the girl who asked about media accountability. And to her, I would give a much simpler answer and say that the best answer to having media be accountable is to hire people of color and to hire black people as the beneficiaries of oppression. They're the ones who are most equipped to, undertake it and to deconstruct it. So that's a great answer. I think both Vice and TIFF can both benefit from such advice. But my question was kind of a follow-up to the student's question back there. In this film and a lot of black scholarship, we talk about death a lot, and a lot of the possibilities for black resistance have been born out of understanding black life as suffering, as an inevitability towards death. And I haven't seen much, possibility for life, as James Baldwin so proclaimed, being an optimist and all. But in the same vein, recognizing the kind of, inevitability of death for all of us. So I was wondering, other than simply survival, where is there room for life in the black narrative?
I'm still trying to figure that out.
I'm not nearly that pessimistic. I see examples of black excellence, black genius, black joy all around me. It's everywhere in incredible art that's being made right now. What do you guys think?
There's joy in struggle. I think when you look back at the activists, for instance, in the 1960s, feminists, anti-racists, gay rights movement, environmentalism, anti-war, et cetera, et cetera. There was a great deal of joy. And it showed up in the music, it showed up in the art, and hope. And at the same time, there was also this great desire to move the society forward. And in fact, the society did get moved forward. And then people got jobs and started families and slowed down in some ways. And I think that the possibility for that kind of joy in activism, that joy in resistance, pleasure in resistance, happiness in resistance, is still here. Absolutely. And it's just a matter of our own personal philosophy and understanding that in the end, it really is about betterment. It's about positivity in the end. And that should be what I think is always kept in our hearts as we move or attempt to move the society further forward without any pessimism about slipping back.
I want to go back up here in case there is someone who's got a question. I see someone waving a hand. Yes? We're going to try to get a microphone up to you, and then we'll come down here.
Well, I can speak loudly.
All right.
To the panel, be careful not to equate Black experience in the U.S. and Canada. Thank you.
I just live from the States, so I just had to say that. It's
Yep.
a world of difference. I'm from Detroit. So
All right.
Absolutely.
Let's let the gentleman speak. Continue, please. Do you have a question?
I hope. Well, it's a statement and a question.
Can you jump to the question?
Over the years, I met Coretta Scott King on 3 occasions. In 1986-87, she appeared before the House of Commons Committee on Human Rights. At that time, Howard McCurdy, the NDP black member of the committee, attacked Coretta Scott King for saying the black experience in Canada is the same as the US. And Howard went after her like you wouldn't believe. Be careful to equate. 4 years ago,
Are you black?
4 years ago, 4 years ago, Obama went to Memphis, Tennessee. The Booker T. Washington High School had 137 graduates. Every single one was black.
Sir, is there a question?
Yes, there is. Be careful not to equate the two. But at the same time, back to the movie and my real question, which was remember this house. There were 30 pages to it, and McGraw-Hill sued the state for $200,000, I believe it was. Those 30 pages, where are they today? And I'm very concerned about the Martin Luther King assassination. The producer of the film was Raoul, and there's one figure in the Martin Luther King assassination by the name of Raoul, and I'd like to know, where can one see these 30 pages today?
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
The pages are what was used for the narration in the film, so we'll answer that question there. Okay, we'll come right back down here.
I just want to say that back in 1987, I was an assistant to Howard McCurdy, who was at that point the only black member of parliament. And it is absolutely the case that Howard understood that, of course, African Canadian and African American situations are different. We have a different country. We have a different constitution. We have a different set of structural facts. At the same time, that's true. Howard understood and understands, as I do, that the situation of oppression certainly feels similar. The context of oppression certainly feels similar at times. The gravity of that oppression feels similar at times, which is why African American experiences has been so influential for African Canadians. At the same time, that's true. We do react differently because we have a different set of conditions, because we are in a different space. So I thank you for illustrating or pointing out the fact that there is a border, there's a 49th parallel, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, that's true. Leave it to our intelligence to figure out how we should respond to acts of oppression that affect us.
I feel like we're just getting started, but we are going to have to wrap up soon, so please go ahead.
So I just want to take a quick second to thank you for your question, because I do think it's kind of shitty that you literally were talking about not knowing how to use your voice and for chit-chat comments to be happening in the back. So I just want to take a moment to partner, like acknowledge that, because I think that's stupid. And as an artist myself, I'm working with my sister right now on a development of like a TV series through a conference called BinderCon. If anyone's heard of that, check them out. They're really awesome. And we're discussing things about like mental illness and like intimacy, love, sex, and relationships. And the only way I was able to get through like a childhood of like with a lot of abuse and mental illness as someone like with an anxiety disorder and bipolar disorder, art was something that kept me alive and was like a safe place for me to go into. But I do really agree with your statement you made about weapons of mass distraction and how, especially with the way the zeitgeist has been moving in terms of what's popular, I have seen a lot of people kind of taking advantage of this narrative and trying to turn it more into a commodity, which I think is where a lot of times it falls into the tenet or subcategory of mass distraction instead of like empowerment or reaffirming of your experiences. So I just wanted to brains a little bit and say like what tenets of good art stand out to you or like things that you notice through art through your life. So basically like the opposite of weapon of mass distraction, basically. Also, sorry, I have one comment. Someone asked something about like good protesting and how to properly protest. And something that I've noticed in my community is really just people turning to each other in terms of resources. Like there's this one trans woman that I'm friends with on Facebook who's friends with another trans woman, and she runs like a cab service. So she's supported by donations, and it's a really good way for queer people to avoid the hell that is public transit. So it might not be, I think sometimes people get overwhelmed with the idea of like taking down the man or the entire structure, which is something that's impossible for one person to do. But in ways in which we can rely on each other and support each other through community and any resources that we can. And then that kind of bypasses the whole privilege aspect of it in terms of like person with me with mental illness, I'm not gonna be out in the streets protesting, like I can't handle it. I have to deal with my home situation right now. So that would be my suggestion to everyone here is just finding ways to reach out and help in your community or ways that are helpful for you and literally in any way, shape, form, or possible. Shout out to Rihanna, you don't have to be rich to help people out. So yeah, that's my little thing.
How did it take that long to get to Rihanna? All right, who wants to answer that?
Okay, first, I need to just say to this gentleman's last question, you had a warning for us. Please be careful not to tell other people how to describe their experience. That's very important. Now, to your question, a couple, we're allowed to describe our own experience in our own terms.
One speaker at a time. Go ahead.
So, to your question, the first things I said about Baldwin that I appreciated as an artist were his clarity and his vulnerability, and that's what I strive to do. That's what I look for in other artists as well, and what I would encourage any artist to try to do is to be as honest and personal about their experiences and their vulnerabilities, and true to that, and also the clarity piece, which takes a lot of effort. A lot of serious, rigorous thought in order to give people something that's clarifying for them as well.
Thank you. We are going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but I think this is a great place to end in terms of clarity, vulnerability. The last thing I would say is if you haven't already, please read more Baldwin. I think all of us will find it inspiring. I want to ask you to please join me in thanking Shad Kabango, Huda Hassan, and George Elliott Clarke. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.